before meeting and moving in with my current girlfriend, I had quite a few bad experiences with some previous homes. One particular story is about an apartment I lived in. Each building on the property had 3 floors with 4 apartments on each floor, as well as a laundry room on every floor. We had shared washers and dryers. My apartment was on the 2nd floor, at the end of the hallway. The complex itself wasn't too bad. Unfortunately, it seemed like my place was directly below a couple who only communicated by yelling at each other, although it never seemed to escalate beyond that. Someone else cooked a lot because it usually smelled delicious when I got home, although sometimes they used too much onion. But the real problem I had with this place, the problem that eventually made me move out, was a person who lived on the same floor as me, but in a different building. I'll refer to him as Todd. When I moved in, my brother and a few friends helped me with the large items. I'm a very small woman, so there was no way I could carry the couch, bed, or dresser by myself. A few times while we were moving things back and forth, Todd would come out of his door and nod at us or step aside when we were carrying something heavy, but he didn't speak to us, at least not then. However, on one of the last days of the move, I was alone, picking up those last small items I could easily fit in my car. I was carrying an open box of cleaning supplies under one arm and a trash bag with random items in the other hand when Todd came out of his room and immediately reached for the box to offer his help. I'm pretty bad at meeting new people or making small talk, so I just smiled and said, "Thanks." As we walked down the hallway, I stayed quiet, and he introduced himself. After I opened the door, I set the bag on the floor and took the box back from him. With the box back in my hands, I told him my name and thanked him again. He tried to start a conversation with me. "You're moving in, huh?" he said, obviously trying to make small talk. He seemed just as bad as I was at initiating a chat. I chuckled a little and said yes, and he pointed toward his apartment and told me that if I needed help moving anything else or assembling anything, I should just let him know. I thanked him and closed the door as he walked away. The rest of that first week was pretty quiet. I was mainly unpacking, settling in, and keeping to myself while organizing my new place. The only thing that kept happening was seeing Todd whenever I left or arrived home. He also seemed to be coming or going around the same time. Sometimes, while taking out the trash, he would always greet me and try to make small talk, but that was it. However, as time went on, seeing him like that became more frequent, and actually, quite predictable. To be honest, it started to get annoying. Between my job and trying to finish my degree, I didn't have much free time. Sometimes, I had just half an hour to get home from work, change, and head to class. But even on those days when it was obvious I was in a rush, Todd wanted to have long conversations. I know I might sound like a jerk, but I honestly don't care. When someone is clearly rushing to their door, and you see them come and go quickly, and it's always on the same day of the week, you might figure they're busy, right? But not Todd. Todd would follow me to my door, telling me about something that happened to him that day, and I'd just stand there waiting for him to finish his story before going into my apartment. What else was I supposed to do? Slam the door in his face? There was one time he wanted to show me something in his apartment, and I told him I didn't have time on Wednesdays, and he understood. So, I guess being direct with him worked. Todd stopped trying to have long conversations on Wednesdays. Instead, he started always opening the building door whenever I got home from work. He would always be by the door for some reason and would hold it open for me, wishing me a good night. The fact that he was there every week seemed a bit strange to me. Think about it, your neighbor, whom you barely know, waits for you every week at the entrance of the building. But at the time, I just thought maybe that was how Todd was, that maybe he was like the neighborhood watchman, or, in this case, the complex watchman. Who knows? But then I started to notice that whenever I had free time, Todd was always around. When I went out for a walk, he would come out too. When I went to the grocery store, he'd be at his door, asking if I wanted this or that, saying he had bought too many bananas or loaves of bread and didn't want them to go bad. I couldn't even sit at the Starbucks I liked on Fridays in peace, because he would always end up there too. He always acted surprised to see me and tried to talk to me. Like I said, I know I sound like a jerk here, and I admit I didn't mind having a conversation from time to time. I could even understand that maybe he was just lonely and wanted company. We were probably the closest in age compared to everyone else I'd seen in our complex, so I felt a little bad. But it was all starting to become a regular part of my daily life, and to me, that felt weird. I barely knew him, yet he would sit with me for coffee as if we were lifelong friends. When I started talking about this with a good friend of mine, she made an interesting point. How was he able to do all of this? How did he know almost the exact time I would come home or go out? I certainly hadn't shared my schedule with him. I had just mentioned that I was in school and working, not expecting it to be a big deal. I work as an executive assistant and secretary, so even if he had tried to call to get my schedule, he would have either spoken to me or to a woman I work with, and she would have told me if someone called asking about me. My friend suggested I keep an eye on him to make sure he wasn't stalking me. At the time, I thought that was a bit dramatic. I could see him following me around for company, but stalking me? There was no reason to stalk me. I wasn't an outstanding girl or anything. But the thought lingered in the back of my mind nonetheless. One Saturday night, my opinion changed drastically. I went out with some friends for dinner and a movie, and afterward, we went for drinks before I finally decided to head home. My friend offered to let me stay at her place to save me the cost of an Uber, but I had homework to finish before Monday, so I declined and told her I'd call her the next day. I wish I had stayed. It was probably around 1 a.m. when I finally entered the complex. As I passed by Todd's apartment, I heard his door open. Tired and slightly intoxicated, I kept walking toward my apartment, ignoring his calls. Once inside, I locked the door, took off my shoes, and then Todd started banging on the door. I reluctantly opened it, hoping he wouldn't stay long. He smiled and said, "Long night, huh?" I nodded, trying to show I wasn't in the mood to talk. "I got worried when I didn't hear you come back at your usual time," he said. My usual time? How did he know what my usual time was? I asked him about it, and he mentioned how I normally got back from my classes on Saturday afternoons and didn't usually go out unless it was for a walk. What the hell? Had he been following me? My head was spinning, and my heart was racing, but I still asked him, "How do you know when I come home, Todd? Are you stalking me?" He seemed offended by my comment and immediately became defensive, saying he wasn't stalking me, just looking out for me because I was young, small, and living alone. I told him I didn't need him to look out for me, that I was managing just fine on my own. He raised his hands and said, "Fine. I thought you'd appreciate the gesture," I explained again. As always, he seemed to be close by, and how that made me uncomfortable. I told him he was controlling me more than my own father. He didn't seem to like that answer. I could see his temples tense as he clenched his jaw, knowing nothing good would come of this. I told him it would be best if he left me alone and tried to close the door, but he stopped it. He slammed his hands against the door and then started shouting about how I should be grateful for everything he did. He went on and on about how stalking is following someone, but that he was just watching over me to know where I was going. After overwhelming me with this nonsensical speech, he pointed his finger at me and said, "In fact, I think you owe me for everything I do for you," and he tried to force his way into my apartment. I yelled at him to leave me alone and get out. But he kept struggling with the door, And then, between the alcohol, the stress, and the fear, my head and stomach churned, and I threw up all over him. I guess that was a solution because he jumped back. He called me disgusting and left immediately. I locked the door and ran to get my phone to call the police. While I was on the phone, I heard someone knocking on the door. I looked through the peephole and saw it was the middle-aged woman who lived in the apartment across from mine. I opened the door slightly, and she told me she had heard the shouting and had called the police, which made sense because they were already coming in as she knocked. I explained what happened to the police, and they went to his apartment, but he didn't respond. They knocked, pounded hard on the door, but he didn't answer. In the end, I decided to press charges, and the next day, I talked to the office management to ask about moving to a different building. I was upset. I had just moved to this place and couldn't afford to go through more application fees and deposits. So that was my only option. Fortunately, they took it very seriously and were able to move me pretty quickly. I stayed at a friend's house until I moved into the new apartment, and I always had someone with me during the moving process. Surprisingly, I didn't see Todd even once throughout the whole process. Not that I'm complaining. I'm just grateful that nothing worse happened that night, as embarrassing as it was. I think it certainly helped. Oh, I'm very thankful to that good neighbor who called the police and came to check on me. I'm not even mad that she didn't come earlier. She was older than me but just as small, and she had 2 kids there. So, I understand. As for Todd, I just hope we never cross paths again. Alright, the story might be a bit different, but I still thought you might be interested in sharing it on your channel. So, here it goes. I moved into a new house in 2021. It was a nice little house, just perfect for me. It had 2 bedrooms, a full basement, and an attached garage, which was practically perfect for what I needed. Plus, it was my first home purchase after renting before, and that hadn't worked out well with the landlords. You see, I foster dogs, and when I moved into my previous place, I had told the landlords about it to make sure they were okay with it. But after 2 years, they gave me an ultimatum: either get rid of the dogs or move out. Obviously, I chose my dogs. I was pretty excited about my new place because I planned to renovate the entire garage to turn it into their little paradise. Of course, they would have access to the house, but they would also have their beds, toys, food, and entertainment in the garage. Some of the dogs I rescued came from bad environments and sometimes preferred to have their own safe space, and I respected that. They deserved it. Anyway, I'm getting a bit off track. My new house was going to open up many doors for me and my dogs, so everything seemed perfect. When I started moving in, I noticed the usual neighbors watching from their porches or kids staring at me as they rode by on their bikes, nothing too remarkable. But because I had a lot of stuff and big equipment, it took me a few days to move everything in. I even had some friends and co-workers helping me. One late night, it was one of those "I'm so tired of moving" moments, but I got a second wind and just wanted to finish already. So, I gathered whoever I could with promises of beer and free food, and we finally wrapped up around 2 in the morning. As we were sitting in my living room relaxing, someone knocked on the door. To my surprise, it was a police officer. He said he was there because of a disturbance report. I was confused, wondering if maybe they had the wrong address, but I let him in and explained that I had just finished moving in. I think after he saw us all sitting in the living room with drinks and video game controllers, he understood what had happened. He just reminded me to be mindful of the amount of noise we were making, considering the time. I apologized and assured him we would keep it down. I knew we were laughing and talking pretty loudly, but I didn't think it was that bad. Over time, I noticed that several of my neighbors were quite observant. Sometimes when I went to get my mail, the elderly lady who lived next door would go for hers too. But as soon as I got close, she would quickly grab her letters, stop looking through them, and hurry back toward her house. But she wouldn't go inside. Instead, she'd stay near her trash bin, pretending to check or adjust it. I think I caught her by surprise because I could see that she was watching me. When we finally made eye contact, she immediately ran into her house. It seemed odd, but I just chalked it up to her being that typical old lady. She'd probably lived there for decades and didn't like new people. Not to mention, I'm sure I looked pretty intimidating. But I let it go. I didn't need to make friends with my neighbors or have everyone like me. As long as they left me alone, I didn't care. But she wasn't the only one who would watch me. One Sunday, while mowing the lawn, I started to feel like I was being watched. I looked around and noticed two kids standing with their bikes near the road in front of my house, staring at me. I waved at them, but instead of waving or smiling back, they just got on their bikes and rode away. As I watched them leave, I noticed a couple standing on the porch across the street, also watching me. The woman was on the phone, repeatedly pointing toward my house and gesturing with her hands, while the man stood on the steps with his arms crossed, glaring at me. I didn't know what their problem was, but I didn't like the idea of being watched and pointed at. I tried to finish mowing the lawn as quickly as possible so I could go back inside. When I went to the shed to put away the lawnmower, I noticed the couple from across the street was now in their backyard, and the man was trying to look over the fence into my yard. I couldn't understand why they found me so interesting, but honestly, it was pretty annoying. I called out to him, saying something like, "Hey, how's it going?" It seemed to catch him off guard because he immediately backed away, shouted something to his wife, and they both hurried inside their house. Things like that kept happening for weeks. I'd get home, and someone would come outside to watch me. If it was daytime, some of them would quickly go back inside, and I even heard the people across the street calling their kids inside while they were playing in the yard. I started to think that something was going on that I wasn't aware of. Was this going to be a regular thing for me? I finally had the freedom to do whatever I wanted in my own house, and my neighbors were going to make me feel like I was in some kind of prison, constantly being watched. Then, I finally had a chance to confront the situation head-on. On my day off, I decided to stop by a coffee shop to start the day. While waiting for my coffee, I noticed one of my neighbors sitting at a nearby table, looking intently at his tablet. He was the only person in the neighborhood who had ever tried to talk to me. Usually, he kept to himself, but if he was outside when I drove by or walked with one of the dogs, he would wave. I had also seen him at this coffee shop a few times, and we would just smile and nod at each other. He never tried to avoid me, so I thought maybe I could clear the air with him. I approached and greeted him, and after asking how he was, he invited me to sit with him. After a bit of small talk, I mentioned how the neighborhood seemed to be keeping a close eye on each other. He laughed and made a comment about how they weren't very subtle about it, which was why he kept to himself, too. I asked him what he meant by that, and he said without hesitation, "I think they're just afraid of you." Then he started laughing. I was confused. Why would they be afraid of me? Like I mentioned, I might look a bit intimidating. I'm a big guy, bald, with tattoos on both arms, but I don't try to come off as tough or intimidating. The only time I need to do that is at work because I'm a security guard in a high-level office building. So, I asked him if that's what he meant. He shrugged and said it was probably because people had been cooped up at home and didn't have anything better to do with their time than make things up. I enjoyed talking with him because I realized he reminded me a lot of myself, honest and straightforward, even if it wasn't what you wanted to hear, and I appreciated that. But after finding this out, I didn't know how to react or what to do. Was I supposed to go door to door and tell people about myself? Put up a sign that said, "I'm not a bad guy"? Was I supposed to live with people thinking I was some kind of blemish on their community? At that point, I told myself that either the rumors would die out, or I would have a chance to clear them up when the time came. Just a few days later, I decided to take one of my shyest dogs for a walk to give him some one-on-one time with me. I walked by the house of the older man, Neil, as I came to know his name, and he was outside talking to the woman who lived across from me, the one I had seen talking on the phone. She was standing next to a kid who was holding a flyer. Neil called out my name, so I looked over and waved, but then he motioned for me to come over. I hadn't planned on interacting with anyone, so I didn't have a mask with me at the time. I hesitated to approach since all three of them were still wearing theirs. Even with their faces covered, I could see the look of disapproval on the woman's face as she pulled the child closer to her. Reluctantly, I walked over, using my shirt to cover my face, apologizing for not having a mask. Neil brushed it off, saying it was fine, and the others agreed. He immediately introduced me to the woman, confirming that she lived across from me, and, true to his style, said, "Clayton here thinks people don't like him. Have you heard anything about that, Sarah?" I saw the color drain from her face as she tried to avoid laughing to cover up the awkward situation. She tried to deny it, so Neil chuckled and turned back to me, asking about my life. He asked what I did for work, and I explained that I worked in security and briefly mentioned where, as it wasn't too far away, maybe 10 or 12 miles. I also told him that I worked the night shift, which is why I left late at night, returned early in the morning, and wasn't usually seen during the day because I was either sleeping or taking care of my dogs. Then he asked about my dog, and the kid asked if he could pet him. I said yes, that he was friendly, and then explained that I fostered dogs. That's when Sarah asked, "Do people also adopt dogs from your house?" I confirmed that they did and explained that some people came by during the day to see the dogs and possibly adopt them. Her face shifted to one of understanding, like something finally clicked for her. It was starting to make sense to me too. These people saw me at odd hours, noticed people coming in and out, and probably heard strange noises because I worked in the garage. Maybe some of the dogs cried or whined because they didn't like baths. Who knows? But I was beginning to see what Neil was doing. He never confirmed it, but I guess he had heard some of the things people were saying, which is why he brought up those specific topics. Sarah relaxed a lot as we talked, probably even more when the kid asked me if I wanted to help with his school fundraiser. I said yes, he was selling chocolate bars, and chocolate is my weakness. So, I bought an entire box. I think I became that kid's best friend that day. Anyway, after chatting for a few more minutes, I said goodbye and went back home. That night, I felt a bit strange. I was happy to have talked with someone besides Neil and cleared things up, but at the same time, I felt a little bad knowing there were probably rumors about me. But when I talked to my mom about it, she made a good point. She pointed out that I was the one who seemed like the weird, suspicious neighbor. I was actually the strange neighbor to everyone else. That made me laugh. I still live in the same place, and now the kids come over to play with the dogs, which is great because it gives the dogs a chance to burn off a lot of energy. They never skip my house when they have any kind of fundraiser. It has become a much better place to live, knowing that your neighbors support you. Even the elderly lady next door still keeps her distance, but she doesn't mind when I shovel her driveway or mow her lawn. So yeah, that's my story of how the roles got reversed and how, for a while, I was the weird neighbor. The neighborhood had always been quiet, a small suburban oasis where everyone knew each other by name and the gardens were meticulously maintained. I moved in 3 years ago, drawn by the tree-lined streets and the promise of a peaceful life. But that was before the Simons moved in next door. It all started small, as these things often do. The Simons arrived in the dead of night, their moving truck groaning under the weight of what seemed like an excessive amount of furniture for a house that size. I watched from my window as they unloaded, noticing they didn't use any lights, just dark silhouettes under the faint street lights. I ignored it, thinking they were just night owls. The first unsettling incident happened a few weeks later. I was gardening in front of my house when I noticed Mrs. Simon standing at her window, staring at me. Her face was expressionless, her eyes unblinking. I waved to her in a friendly manner, but she didn't respond, she just stood there, watching. A chill ran down my spine, and I retreated inside. Then came the noises. At first, I thought I was imagining them, strange scraping sounds in the dead of night, heavy thuds, and what seemed like low murmurs. I wasn't the only one who had heard them. My neighbor across the street, Mrs. Kowalski, mentioned it one morning while we were picking up our mail. "Have you heard those noises from the Simons' house? It sounds like they're dragging furniture at all hours," she said, shaking her head. "Strange people, those Simons." I nodded, relieved not to be alone in my suspicions. We both laughed it off, but the unease remained. Things got worse when pets started disappearing. First, it was Muffin, the Johnsons' cat, and then Rex, the Crin family's dog. The neighborhood was filled with worry and suspicion. I kept a close eye on my own cat, Whiskers, making sure he didn't stray too far from home. One afternoon, I went for a walk and saw Mr. Simon in his backyard, digging in the garden, which was already full of several freshly dug holes. I couldn't help but feel a mix of curiosity and fear. What was he burying? I decided to confront him. But as I approached, he stopped digging and turned to look at me, his expression unreadable in the twilight. "Good evening," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Good evening," he replied curtly, wiping his forehead with a dirty sleeve. "Were you digging?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Gardening," he said in a flat tone. "Planning to plant some new trees." I nodded, pretending to believe him, but the uneasiness grew. That night, I barely slept, haunted by images of those holes and what might be buried in them. A few days later, Whiskers disappeared. I searched everywhere, calling his name until my voice was hoarse. I couldn't shake the feeling that the Simons had something to do with it. Desperation led me to a reckless decision. In the middle of the night, I snuck into their backyard. The full moon cast a ghostly glow over the garden. I approached one of the holes and started digging, my heart pounding in my chest. Fear and adrenaline made my hands tremble. After a few moments, I unearthed something stained with blood. It was Whiskers. I was so absorbed in my grim discovery that I didn't hear Mr. Simon approach. His hand clamped down on my shoulder, and I turned around with a scream caught in my throat. "Looking for something?" he asked, his voice cold and emotionless. My mind raced, trying to come up with an excuse, but all I could do was stammer incoherently. He stared at me intently, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of something almost human in his eyes, but it vanished quickly. "Stay out of my yard," he said, his grip tightening painfully before he finally let me go. I backed away, my pulse pounding in my ears. "Next time, you won't be so lucky." I fled, clutching Whiskers' collar against my chest. I locked all the doors and windows, my mind racing with fear and grief. I called the police the next day, but they found no evidence of foul play. The Simons continued their strange, unsettling existence, while I lived in a constant state of fear, always looking over my shoulder. Months passed, and a few other pets disappeared. The neighborhood seemed to shrink away, avoiding the Simon's house, a black hole of dread and unanswered questions. I never truly understood what they were doing, but I moved out as soon as I could, unable to bear their presence any longer. Now, years later, I still dream of that night, of the holes in the ground and Mr. Simon's cold, unfeeling eyes. I'll never forget the terror that gripped our neighborhood, that darkness that seemed to seep into the very ground, turning our suburban paradise into a nightmare. So, friends, that was a collection of some creepy neighbor stories. Creepy neighbors is technically applicable, but that's not what will appear in the thumbnail or the video title, so I won't say it. I have to keep my SEO in check because, if not, it won't be optimized for search engines and will be undetectable. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this collection of creepy neighbor stories. I love them. Fantastic stories. As always, neighbors are creepy. I usually try to have an anecdote at the end of my videos like this one, but I don't have one. I've said it before, and I'll say it again, my neighbor is fantastic. She's a very nice lady and deaf. I mow her lawn, and she takes out the trash bins on Sundays when I forget to do it, because trash day is Monday. So, a great neighbor. Fantastic neighbor. Our last neighbors were fine. They had 2 kids, good people. Then they moved out, and we had some neighbors who ran an illegal daycare. That was fun. Sarcastically speaking, it wasn't fun at all. The kids were very loud. I guess Carl was also a neighbor, and he wasn't fun either. He was a bit crazy, had mental health issues, and I don't mean that in a mean way. I mean literally, he had mental health issues. And I guess there was another neighbor down the block who never got along with his girlfriend. They were always yelling. He tried to harm himself in front of the police, if that makes sense. It didn't happen, thankfully, but it did cause a lockdown at the elementary school behind us. But now, I don't have those neighbors anymore. They're all gone. Disappeared. Don't ask why or how. Nope, they just all left. This happened in my old apartment, where I lived for a few years. It's been several years since I moved out, but I had a bad experience with some of my neighbors while I was there, and that's what this story is about. The building had character because it was old, at least 100 years, from the looks of it, with a red brick exterior. My unit was small but charming, taking up the entire top floor of the house. Some parts of my place had sloped ceilings due to the roof's angle, making it an awkward space to live in, but it had its perks, especially the balcony, which offered views of the city skyline. The neighbors on the main floor were a group of 3 guys, all in their early 20s, attending a nearby college. I didn't know them well because I had finished university a few years earlier and had moved past that lifestyle. They clearly enjoyed partying, and I would hear them late at night at least a few times a week. One of them, whom I'll call Evan, was the most annoying and had an arrogance that I noticed immediately. Initially, I tried to coexist peacefully. I introduced myself one afternoon, offering a friendly, though cautious, olive branch. Evan was cordial enough, shaking my hand with a grip that was a bit too firm. Their gatherings became more frequent and louder. At first, I didn't complain. It could be pretty annoying, but I let it go. However, what really bothered me was that they started hanging out on the balcony outside my apartment. It was on my floor and opened directly onto my place. There was a fire escape from the balcony that went down to the ground, so they would use it to climb up. Technically, it was part of my place, but it became their preferred spot to gather late at night. I reached my limit one night when the usual noise turned into shouting. It was barely 2 a.m. on a Thursday, so I felt it was reasonable to expect some peace and quiet. If they had stayed in their own apartment, I would have let it slide, but a group of 3 guys was right outside my window on the small balcony that was supposed to be part of my apartment. They never asked for permission to use it, they just climbed up uninvited. Eventually, I went outside to confront them. At first, I tried to be polite, but they were drunk, and I could tell they weren't going to be reasonable. Evan stepped forward with an aggressive posture. "This balcony is as much mine as it is yours," he said with a mocking smile, a statement so blatantly false that it left me stunned. Not wanting to get into a fight with 3 drunk college guys, I gave up and closed the balcony door. After I left, I heard one of them shout something like, "Yeah, that's what I thought." I went back to bed but didn't fall asleep until at least 3:30. The next day, after work, I called the landlord, hoping he'd talk to the guys, but he didn't want to get involved. He basically told me to sort it out on my own. I didn't know what to do. I started staying at my girlfriend's place at least a few nights a week to avoid them, but it was still a big problem. One weekend night, I went out with my friends and had a few drinks. I was far from drunk, but I'd had about 4 beers, so I was a bit tipsy. As I walked back to my place, I could see 3 people on the balcony across the street. I knew they were at it again. I climbed the stairs to my apartment, and when I got inside, the noise was really loud. They had music playing and were talking loudly. I sat there, fuming for a few minutes, before deciding to confront them again. This time, I didn't plan to be so nice. I opened the curtains and saw my 3 neighbors looking back at me, but they didn't have the decency to turn the music down. I opened the door and stepped outside. Evan looked at me, and I yelled at them to get the hell out. Evan stood up and got in my face. We were chest to chest, shouting at each other. Then he shoved me back. My back hit the doorframe, and as soon as I regained my balance, I shoved him back. He stumbled backward against the balcony railing, and as soon as his hip hit the black iron rail, he lost his balance and fell over the side. The moment I saw him fall, I knew I had made a mistake. A fall from the 2nd floor could cause serious injury depending on how he landed. There was grass below, but it was still very dangerous. I froze as his friends rushed over to check on him. To my relief, he seemed to be okay, but it wasn't a good night for me regardless. After the fall, the guys left the balcony, but I don't know if they took him to the hospital or not. They never called the police about what I did, but I always knew they had that over me. Even though he pushed me first, there were 2 witnesses who could have told the story any way they wanted. I never felt comfortable in that apartment again because I had 3 declared enemies right below me all the time. Part of me was afraid they might press charges, and another part was afraid they might retaliate in some way. I didn't stick around long enough to find out. I gave my 1-month notice shortly after the incident, and almost every night before I moved out, I stayed at my girlfriend's place. I know I'm not completely innocent in all of this, but it was an accident, and those guys were real jerks. When I was in my 20s, I moved to a new city for a job opportunity and found myself living alone in an apartment building. It was a 25-story tower where people lived in close proximity but barely knew each other. I wasn't any different, and at first, I didn't make much effort to meet anyone. I had come for work, and my job took up most of my time. I was still young and trying to learn as much as possible, so I didn't think I had time for much else. My life was a simple routine: work, home, and the occasional trip to visit family. I wasn't the type to make friends easily, so I spent most of my free time alone. I'm an avid reader and usually spend at least 2 hours every night with a book on my sofa. I had been there for about a month, and nothing out of the ordinary had happened. Then, I started to notice one of my neighbors. This man was a bit older, with a disheveled appearance, and seemed to be everywhere. Let's call him Stan for this story, but I don't know what his real name was. Stan lurked around the hallways all the time, which was odd, and at first, I thought he was a homeless person who had snuck in. But then I found out he lived in the building, not on my floor, but he definitely had a place there. There was something about him that made me anxious every time I passed by. One afternoon, I was reading a book in my apartment when I heard a faint noise right outside my door. Looking through the peephole, I saw Stan sitting on the floor of my hallway, just outside my unit. He was leaning against the wall opposite my apartment. I didn't know what to do or why he was there. Maybe he was waiting for me to come out, and if that was the case, I worried about what he might do. I didn't dare leave while he was there, although I hadn't planned to go out anyway. I ignored him and went back to my book, making sure the door was securely locked. Before I went to bed, I checked again, and he was still there. That meant he had been sitting there for at least an hour, as far as I knew. The next day, when I left for work, thankfully, he was gone, but on the floor next to my door was a small pile of trash, a crushed Coke can and some food wrappers that must have come from that strange neighbor of mine. I saw Stan around, as usual, over the next few days, and then something else happened. It was around 10 p.m., and I was about to take a shower before bed. Just as I turned on the water, I heard someone trying to open my front door. I looked through the peephole, but no one was there. After waiting for about 10 seconds, I cracked open the door and peeked down the hallway. My strange neighbor was there, walking through the hall. He seemed to be carrying an empty trash bag, which made me think he had been trying to rob me. These incidents pushed me to talk to my other neighbors to see if anyone else had similar experiences. I met a young couple, Sarah and Tom, a few doors down, and I also spoke with an older woman named June. As we shared our experiences, a picture began to emerge of a deeply disturbed man. Sarah and Tom told me about a time they found him standing silently in the laundry room, staring at the machines without using them. June mentioned that he had once followed her to the mailroom, muttering to himself. We all agreed that his behavior wasn't just odd, it was alarming. Some time passed, and eventually, he was gone. At first, I didn't know why, but one afternoon I ran into Tom in the mailroom. He told me that Stan had been arrested and kicked out of the building. Tom said Stan had broken into an apartment a few floors below mine, which he believed was his own floor. Stan had tried to force his way in, but when the occupant managed to close the door, Stan broke it down. Fortunately, no one was hurt, but the person called the police, and Stan was arrested. I don't know what happened to him after that, but I never saw him again. I hope he got help for whatever was going on, but most likely, he spent some time in jail and was then thrown out of the building. Knowing he was capable of breaking down one of those doors made me feel even more uneasy about the incidents that happened to me. The whole time he sat outside my door, he could have broken it down at any moment, but for some reason, he chose not to. I still don't know why, but I'm glad he spared me. I grew up in a middle-class neighborhood that was fairly new. Mostly, there were single-family homes, but there was also an apartment complex a few doors down from our house. Since all the units were rentals, the people who lived in the apartments would come and go frequently. Some of my good friends lived there, so I often hung out there. One summer, a new family moved into the apartments. They had a son named Manny, who was about my age, and we soon found out that we would be classmates. Manny was different from the beginning, not like the other boys I knew, though not in a bad way at first. We started hanging out during the summer while he was getting settled, and we had a lot of fun right from the start. There was never a dull moment when he was around because he was really, really funny and always up for anything. We began spending time together because that's what you do when you're a kid. Manny always had ideas for things to do, but his ideas weren't always good. In fact, sometimes they were downright scary. I vividly remember one day at his apartment. We were all there, a group of us just hanging out. It was me, Manny, Brent, and my brother Joseph. Manny's mom wasn't home, and we were watching TV in the living room. Suddenly, Manny turned to Brent and said he could kill him if he wanted to. We all laughed, but it was a nervous, uncomfortable laugh. Inside, I felt weird. That wasn't something kids usually said. It was like Manny was expecting someone to challenge him so he could go through with it. We all just sat there silently, not saying a word. Brent was especially quiet. Then there was an incident that happened in the woods. We were hanging out one weekend, walking through the woods near my house to get to the park. When we were on one of the forest trails, I discovered that Manny had brought a water bottle filled with gasoline. He wanted to start a fire and watch it burn. We managed to talk him out of it, and later that day, he said he was just joking. I didn't believe him, though, because I could still smell the gasoline. I still don't know where he got it from. When school started in September, Manny was in the same class as most of my friends. We were still hanging out with him at that time, but to be honest, he was starting to scare me. In the first week of classes, Manny got into a fight with one of the other boys in our class. He wasn't one of my close friends, but he was a kid that most people liked. I never found out what caused the fight, but I think Manny started it. On another occasion, he was fooling around in class, and our teacher told him to be quiet. Manny got up from his desk and stood in front of the teacher as if he were about to fight. Thankfully, he never threw a punch, but it was a tense moment. A few other smaller things happened, and because of all that, my friends and I tried to distance ourselves from him. We avoided him at lunch and didn't invite him to hang out. One afternoon, a few weeks after that day at Brent's apartment, I saw Manny on my way home. He looked at me like he wanted to kill me but didn't say or do anything. I was immediately scared. That night, I woke up to the loud sound of something breaking downstairs. It was the sound of glass shattering. I got up to see what it was, thinking it might be a burglar or something. When I went down, the only thing I found was a broken window and a large rock on the floor of our entry hallway. My dad searched the house, but no one was there. I suspected it was Manny because there wasn't anyone else who could have done something like that, but since I couldn't prove it, we didn't confront his mom about it. The next day at school, though, he basically confessed. He was bragging about it to other kids, saying he was going to kill my family and me next time. The police got involved after that. They warned Manny and told him there would be consequences if he didn't stop. I thought there should have been consequences immediately, but I guess it's more complicated with minors. He stayed away from me for the next few months, but his family moved away before the school year ended. I don't know why they left, and I'm not even sure if it was by choice. Manny had done enough to be expelled from our school, so maybe that was the reason. I hope he ended up somewhere that could handle severe behavior issues, but I'm not sure how likely that is. Our school system isn't the best, and programs like that are very rare. All I know is that now, he's just a distant memory. About 10 years ago, I moved into a new house with my family. We had a 1-year-old son, Felix, with my wife, Jenna. We had been living in a small apartment until then, so getting a whole house was a big step for us. My wife had recently gone back to work, so our finances were pretty solid, and that allowed us to move. We were planning to expand our family as well, so we needed the space. It was a 4-bedroom, 2-story house at the end of a cul-de-sac, with a small creek running alongside it. Our next-door neighbors, Frank and Heather, were an older couple in their 50s. At first, they were friendly and seemed to get along with everyone. They invited us over for dinner, introduced us to other neighbors, and made us feel part of the community. Frank and Heather never had children. They told us they had lived in their house for almost 20 years and were among the longest-standing residents in the area. We went to their house for dinner about a month after we moved in. It was our second time there, and it was the first time something seemed off. For reasons I still don't understand, Heather was tense. At the time, it didn't seem like a big deal, but she definitely seemed upset. I don't think she said more than 10 words all night. She just sat at the end of the table, drinking a glass of red wine while the rest of us talked. At one point, Frank put his hand on her shoulder, and she immediately pulled away. Every couple goes through rough patches from time to time, and it certainly wasn't our place to get involved in their issues, especially since we were so new and didn't know them well. When we got home that night, Jenna mentioned it. I told her I had noticed too, but we decided to let it go for the time being. We saw them both over the next few weeks, and Heather never seemed quite right during that time. One day, when I got home from work, I saw Jenna talking with Frank. They were in our front yard when I pulled into the driveway, so I only caught a glimpse of them as I passed by. Later that night, Jenna told me that Frank had been making inappropriate advances toward her. I was very surprised because I had never seen anything to suggest that, but it did make a certain amount of sense. I never knew the guy very well, but there are definitely strange people out there, so maybe it wasn't that surprising. We decided to keep our distance from them, hoping the issue would resolve itself. Even Jenna said there wasn't anything worth calling the police over, so we didn't have many options other than to let it go. However, Frank continued to act as if nothing had happened. He even invited me over for dinner. Whenever he tried to talk to me, I would turn my back. This went on for a while, and eventually, he seemed to get the hint. I was glad he understood, but I was starting to feel like I had made an enemy. That was scary for us because we didn't know what he was capable of. One night, after putting Felix to bed, Jenna and I were in the living room watching TV. It was around 10 p.m., and the room was pretty dark. Suddenly, one of our motion sensor lights outside the house turned on. It was the one on the side of the house away from the street, so we were alarmed. When I looked out the window, I saw Frank walking back to his house. The way our houses were arranged, there was no reason for him to be close enough to trigger our lights. There was no fence, but he would have had to walk at least 20 feet into our property to set off the lights. He was definitely up to something, we both knew it. Another night, I was on the back porch smoking. I've since quit smoking, but at the time, I did it occasionally, though never inside the house. I had the exterior lights on, and when I went back into the house, they were still on. My wife was in the kitchen at that moment, and then we both went to the living room. After about 5 or 10 minutes, I thought I saw someone standing by the window. The exterior lights were still on, but I figured they should have turned off by then. I didn't make any sudden moves, wanting to catch him in the act, and it was Frank. I quietly and casually got up and walked to the kitchen, then rushed out the back door and went around to where the window was. He was standing there, right next to our window, and he didn't even try to run away. The most unsettling thing was that he was holding his phone and seemed to be taking pictures through our window. I yelled at him to get the hell out and probably said a bunch of other words I won't repeat. That night, we called the police, but they didn't do much. They gave him a warning to stay away from us, but it wasn't enough. We kept seeing him around, but we never caught him in the act again. The real problem was that we couldn't relax, and we never knew what he would do next. Since we had a small child, there was no way we could stay in that neighborhood. The decision to leave wasn't easy. We had invested a lot in that house and had imagined our son growing up there. We put the house on the market, and over the course of a few months, we found a buyer who was willing to take the risk. I still think about Frank's wife, Heather, from time to time. Jenna and I have talked about it a lot, and we both believe Heather was tormented by what her husband was doing. She probably knew and should have done something about it, but something about her made me think it was eating her up inside. I don't know what they're doing now, but I wish the best for everyone who still lives near them. They say that if you lie too many times, there comes a moment when, even if you scream the truth with all your might, no one will believe you. It's a lesson we all learn as children, but we rarely see it unfold in real life in such a brutal way as I did. Living in a small suburban neighborhood where appearances matter and rumors spread like wildfire teaches you a lot about human nature. One of those lessons is that lies, no matter how small, always have consequences. But I never imagined how far those consequences could go until my neighbor disappeared. When I moved into this neighborhood several years ago, everything seemed perfect. It was one of those postcard neighborhoods with well-kept houses, quiet streets, and neighbors who greeted each other with a smile, the kind of place where life was calm, even monotonous, and the biggest worry was what plant to put in the garden next spring. For someone who had grown up in a chaotic city, this little suburban haven seemed like a blessing. I bought the house with the idea of settling down, becoming part of that calm, and enjoying the peace I had always craved. But, of course, nothing is perfect. There is always a shadow behind every bright facade, and in my case, that shadow took the form of a neighbor I would soon learn to avoid. From the moment I met him, I knew something about him wasn't right. At first, it was hard to pinpoint exactly what it was. His smile was too wide, too forced, as if he were trying to hide something darker behind it. He always inserted himself into other people's conversations, making comments that seemed harmless at first glance but carried a barely perceptible hint of malice. There was something about the way he interacted with others that made me feel uncomfortable from the start. But in those early days, I had no idea just how far his influence would reach into my life. At first, as you might expect, I tried to get along with him. Living peacefully with your neighbors is essential, or at least, that's what I thought. I remember the first time he spoke to me was during a warm summer afternoon when I was tidying up the front of my house. He approached me with a smile that, at that moment, seemed genuine. He greeted me and offered me a beer, saying it was a neighborhood tradition to welcome new neighbors. I accepted, not wanting to seem rude, and we sat down on the curb, chatting as we watched the sun begin to set behind the hills. During that conversation, he spoke to me about the other neighbors as if he were sharing valuable information with me. At first, I thought he was just being friendly, trying to make me feel included. He told me about the family on the corner, how they always argued quietly in their backyard but made it seem like everything was fine on the outside. He mentioned that the guy in the yellow house had been arrested years ago, although no one else seemed to know about it. Then, he talked about the woman who lived alone, saying she was often seen arriving very late at night, sometimes accompanied by different men. The most disturbing part was the way he said it, as if he were revealing important secrets, hidden truths that only he knew. At that moment, I didn't see it as anything dangerous. I thought he was just one of those nosy neighbors, the kind who always knows what's happening in the neighborhood and enjoys sharing exaggerated stories to pass the time. It wasn't anything I hadn't seen before. But soon, I realized they weren't just harmless stories. His behavior started to make me uneasy. As the months went by, I noticed how his comments became darker, more malicious. The worst part was that he wasn't just talking to me. He was always involved in everyone's business, spreading rumors, dividing people. If a neighbor parked their car poorly, he'd make sure to tell everyone it was done on purpose to annoy them. If someone didn't say hello, he'd interpret it as a sign of arrogance and ensure everyone knew about it. At first, the rest of the neighborhood seemed to give him the benefit of the doubt. After all, there's always someone in every community who enjoys gossip. But as his stories became more extravagant, people began to distance themselves from him. It was clear many didn't know what to make of him. He was the kind of person who made you wonder if he was telling the truth or if it was all just another invention, and that's what made him dangerous, the doubt he sowed. The breaking point came when he started talking about the neighbor in the blue house. I'll never forget the day he first mentioned it to me. I was watering the plants in my garden when he approached me, this time with an expression that seemed more calculating than friendly. "Have you noticed anything strange about the guy in the blue house?" he asked me, almost in a whisper, as if he were sharing the biggest secret. I stared at him, confused. The blue house belonged to a quiet man, a loner who never bothered anyone. He didn't talk much, but he was always polite when I saw him on the street. There was nothing strange about him, at least that I had noticed. "No, why?" I replied, not too interested. And that's when he began to unravel the story. He told me he had been watching the man for weeks. He said he had seen him coming and going from his house at odd hours, always carrying boxes or black bags. According to him, on one occasion, he saw the man carry something large into the garage, something that, from its shape, could have been a body. He said he had started to suspect when he noticed the man never let anyone near his house. No one came in or out, and the garage lights stayed on until the early hours of the morning. As he spoke, my mind tried to rationalize what I was hearing. I knew this neighbor had a reputation for lying, but the way he told the story, the details he provided, it was disturbing. I stood there listening, feeling a growing discomfort. There was something in his tone, in the way his eyes lit up when he talked about what he might have discovered, that made me feel he was enjoying it all too much. "I have proof," he told me finally, with an almost triumphant tone. I asked him what kind of proof, but he didn't give me any details. He just smiled and said I would see, that everything would come to light sooner or later. The following weeks were strange, to say the least. He began telling the story to other neighbors, each time more exaggerated. What started as a mere suspicious observation soon became a full-blown theory. He claimed the man in the blue house was a kidnapper, that he had seen him taking children into the garage, that he had even heard screams in the night. He said there were cameras installed all around his yard to watch the neighbors and that he did it because he knew people were watching him. Despite the disturbing nature of his stories, most of the neighborhood no longer paid attention to him. We all knew him, we knew he enjoyed making things up, exaggerating reality for his own amusement. So, although some neighbors were initially cautious, they soon began to ignore him. No one believed him, no one wanted to get caught up in his game. What surprised me was how insistent he was, even when no one was listening anymore. He seemed more and more desperate for someone to believe him. You could see him at neighborhood events, always trying to approach people, whispering his conspiracy theory, but everyone avoided him. It got to the point where no one even paid attention to him. But his insistence didn't stop. If anything, it seemed to feed on everyone else's indifference. Then one day, he simply disappeared. It took me completely by surprise. One morning, I went out to pick up the newspaper and noticed his car wasn't in the driveway. That wasn't unusual since he often left early. But as the days passed, I began to notice that no one had seen him for a while. His lawn started growing wild and unkempt, which was very unusual for him, and the mail began to pile up in his mailbox. I asked some neighbors if they knew where he was, but everyone seemed just as surprised. Weeks went by, and his house remained empty. There was no sign that he had packed up or moved out, he had just vanished. The neighborhood filled with rumors. Some said he had finally grown tired of no one believing him and had left. Others, more skeptical, suggested it might have been a ploy to get attention. But something didn't add up, something that kept me awake at night. The police came to the neighborhood to ask questions. We didn't know if someone had reported his disappearance or if they were just looking for him for some other reason. The officers asked if we had noticed anything unusual in recent weeks, but what could we say? No one had seen anything. Still, I couldn't help but remember the last words he told me about the proof he had, about how everything would come to light. And then I started to wonder, what if he wasn't lying this time? What if, after all, there was something dark about the blue house? The neighbor in the blue house was still there, living his life with an unsettling calm, as if nothing had changed. The disappearance of our lying neighbor didn't seem to affect him in the slightest. I never saw him looking for answers or asking why his neighbor had disappeared overnight. He just continued with his life, methodical and reserved. The local prosecutor's office has started an investigation, but they haven't found enough evidence to move forward. No footprints, no witnesses, just a missing man and many unanswered questions. Meanwhile, the neighborhood goes on as if this is just another story, just another lie among many. But I can't stop thinking about what might be hidden right in front of us. Because in the end, when someone lies so many times, how do you know if the last lie isn't a lie at all, but actually the truth?